My name is Rachel Thompson, and I'll never forget the moment I discovered why my husband David had been passed over for the Executive Leadership Development Program 3 years in a row. It wasn't because he lacked qualifications, it wasn't because his performance reviews weren't stellar. It was because of me. Specifically, it was because I had once been his superior at his current company, TechFlow Solutions, and certain people in leadership couldn't handle the idea that David might have gotten ahead because of his wife's former influence. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. What they didn't know was that I had been quietly documenting their discriminatory practices for months. While they thought they were protecting their boys' club from the threat of a power couple, I was building a case that would not only expose their illegal behavior but would also lead me to create the most successful leadership training company in Austin, Texas. The look on Robert Mitchell's face when he walked into that leadership conference and saw me presenting to his biggest clients still gives me chills. Now let me take you back to where this corporate nightmare began. I had been a rising star in the corporate training world for nearly a decade when David and I decided to start our family. At 32, I was the youngest director of leadership development that TechFlow Solutions had ever hired, responsible for training executives across 3 states and managing a team of 12 consultants. My programs had increased client retention by 40% and had been featured in Harvard Business Review as a case study in innovative corporate education. David had joined TechFlow as a junior project manager just 6 months before I took the leadership role. We met during a company-wide training session I was conducting on strategic communication. He was brilliant, asking insightful questions that demonstrated a natural understanding of organizational dynamics that many senior leaders lacked. Our relationship developed slowly, professionally at first, then personally, as we discovered we shared not only professional ambitions, but also a vision for building something meaningful together. When we decided to get married, I knew it would complicate our professional dynamic. Corporate policies required disclosure of relationships between supervisors and direct reports, so I made the difficult decision to transition David to a different department entirely. He moved to the technology implementation team, where his background in systems engineering made him an immediate asset. The transition was seamless, and for 2 years we worked for the same company in completely separate divisions with different reporting structures. Everything changed when I became pregnant with our first child, Emma. The pregnancy was difficult, requiring bed rest for the final 3 months. During that time, I watched from home as my carefully constructed leadership programs began to deteriorate under temporary management. Robert Mitchell, who had been passed over for my position when I was hired, took every opportunity to undermine the systems I had built. By the time I returned from maternity leave, half of my team had been reassigned, and my budget had been cut by 30%. The writing was on the wall. Despite my track record and the documented success of my programs, it became clear that my path back to influence at TechFlow would be an uphill battle. When I became pregnant with our second child, Michael, the decision became easier. I negotiated a generous severance package and transitioned to full-time motherhood, confident that David's career trajectory would continue its upward climb. For the first year after I left, everything seemed to progress normally. David received positive performance reviews, led successful project implementations, and even spearheaded an initiative that saved the company over $2 million in operational costs. His annual review that year described him as leadership material and ready for advanced professional development opportunities. Then the applications for the Executive Leadership Development Program opened. This wasn't just any training program, it was a year-long intensive that included executive coaching, MBA-level coursework, mentorship with C-suite leaders, and a capstone project that typically led to promotion to senior management. Only 5 employees company-wide were selected each year, and acceptance virtually guaranteed a fast track to executive leadership. David's application was flawless. His project portfolio demonstrated consistent results, his peer evaluations were outstanding, and his direct supervisor had written a recommendation letter that practically guaranteed his acceptance. We spent weeks preparing for his interview, reviewing case studies and practicing presentation techniques. David was confident, and honestly, so was I. His qualifications were undeniable. The rejection email arrived on a Friday afternoon in March. While your qualifications are impressive, it read, we have selected candidates whose profiles more closely align with our current organizational needs. No specific feedback, no suggestions for improvement, no indication of what those mysterious organizational needs actually were. David was devastated, but he channeled his disappointment into determination. He asked his supervisor, Lisa Rodriguez, for feedback on strengthening his application for the following year. Lisa seemed genuinely puzzled by the rejection and promised to inquire with HR about the selection criteria. When she reported back a week later, her explanation was vague and unsatisfying. The selection committee had simply chosen other candidates. There was no specific feedback available. That summer, David threw himself into professional development on his own. He completed 3 online certifications, volunteered to lead a cross-departmental efficiency project, and even paid for a leadership conference in Dallas out of his own pocket. By the time applications opened for the second year, his resume was even stronger than before. The second rejection stung worse than the first. This time, David's supervisor Lisa had actually sat on the selection committee, and she pulled him aside the day after notifications went out. "David, I want you to know that I advocated strongly for your inclusion," she said, her voice carrying frustration. "Your qualifications are exceptional, but there were other factors in the decision that I'm not at liberty to discuss." Other factors. The phrase echoed in our house for weeks. David became withdrawn, questioning his own abilities, despite all evidence to the contrary. He started talking about looking for opportunities elsewhere, convinced that his career had hit a ceiling at TechFlow. I encouraged him to be patient, to continue building his skills, and to reapply the following year. Surely 3 years of consistent excellence would be impossible to ignore. I was wrong. The third rejection arrived with the same form letter language, the same lack of specific feedback, and the same devastating impact on David's confidence. This time, however, something had changed.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Me. 3 rejections of an obviously qualified candidate weren't just disappointing, they were suspicious. As someone who had spent years in corporate leadership and training, I recognized patterns of discrimination when I saw them. That evening, after David had gone to bed dejected and defeated, I opened my laptop and began researching. I started with the obvious question: who had been selected for the program over the past 3 years? TechFlow's website proudly featured photos and brief biographies of each year's cohort, celebrating their achievements and potential. The pattern was unmistakable. Over 3 years, 15 people had been selected for the program. 14 were men, and 13 of those were single or married to women who worked outside the company. The one woman selected had no children, and had recently completed her MBA at a prestigious university. Not a single participant was married to a former TechFlow employee. I dug deeper, using my network of former colleagues, still working in corporate training, to gather intelligence about selection criteria and decision-making processes. What I discovered made my blood boil. Through carefully worded conversations and strategic questions, I learned that my former position and David's connection to me had been explicitly discussed during selection committee meetings. Jessica Martinez, my former assistant who had maintained her position in the leadership development department, provided the most damning information during a coffee meeting in downtown Austin. We were catching up on life and careers when the conversation naturally turned to David's repeated rejections from the program. "Rachel, I probably shouldn't tell you this," Jessica said, glancing around the busy cafe to ensure we wouldn't be overheard. "But Robert Mitchell has made comments about David during several meetings. He's convinced that David's early success at the company was because of your influence, and he's worried that putting David in the leadership program would validate that perception." I felt my hands tighten around my coffee cup. "What kind of comments?" Jessica hesitated, then continued. "He's said things like we can't have people thinking that marrying the right person is a path to advancement, and David needs to prove himself without any question of favoritism. Linda Patterson in HR has pushed back, but Robert has a lot of influence on the selection committee." The irony was staggering. By trying to prevent the perception of favoritism, Robert Mitchell was actually engaging in discrimination. David was being punished, not for any lack of qualifications or performance, but specifically because he was married to me. The very success that should have made him an attractive candidate was being held against him because of gender bias and corporate politics. That night, I shared Jessica's information with David. His response surprised me. Instead of anger, he showed resignation. "Maybe I should just look for a job somewhere else," he said quietly. "If they're never going to see past their assumptions about us, what's the point of staying?" "The point," I said, my voice steady with newfound determination, "is that what they're doing is illegal. And if we walk away without addressing it, they'll continue discriminating against other employees whose personal lives don't fit their narrow definition of appropriate." Over the following weeks, I began developing a plan. My years in corporate leadership had taught me that organizations rarely change discriminatory practices unless forced to confront them directly. Simply filing a complaint with HR would likely result in a whitewash investigation and subtle retaliation against David. I needed a strategy that would expose the discrimination while protecting David's career and creating leverage for real change. The first step was documentation. I began systematically gathering evidence of the pattern of discrimination, including the demographics of program participants, the stated selection criteria versus actual selection practices, and any written or verbal communications that revealed bias. Jessica became an invaluable ally, discreetly sharing information about selection committee discussions and organizational politics that I couldn't access from the outside. Marcus Johnson, a former colleague from my previous company, who now ran his own consulting firm, provided another perspective when we met for lunch in South Austin. "Rachel, what you're describing sounds like textbook spousal discrimination," he said after I outlined the situation. "It's more common than people realize, especially in companies where leadership positions are seen as limited resources to be protected." Marcus had dealt with similar situations in his consulting work and offered insights into both the legal and strategic aspects of addressing discrimination. "The challenge is that these biases are rarely explicit," he explained. "Companies have learned to avoid obvious discriminatory language while still engaging in discriminatory practices. You need to build a case that demonstrates pattern and intent." His advice was invaluable, but it also reinforced my growing conviction that simply addressing this situation within TechFlow's existing structure wouldn't be sufficient. Robert Mitchell and leaders like him had too much invested in maintaining the status quo. Real change would require external pressure and alternative pathways for talented professionals who didn't fit traditional corporate molds. As summer turned to fall, I found myself spending hours researching not just discrimination law, but also the leadership development industry itself. What I discovered was a field ripe for disruption. Most corporate training programs were built around outdated models that favored traditional career paths and leadership styles. There was a growing demand for more innovative, inclusive approaches to professional development, but few companies were meeting that demand effectively. The idea began forming gradually. What if, instead of simply fighting TechFlow's discrimination, I created an alternative that would demonstrate the value of diverse leadership perspectives? What if I started my own leadership development company? One that would not only serve underrepresented professionals, but would also compete directly with TechFlow's internal programs. The concept was ambitious, perhaps even audacious. I had been out of the corporate training world for over 2 years, focusing on raising our children. Starting a business would require significant financial investment, long hours, and the risk of failure. But it would also provide an opportunity to address systemic problems in the industry while building something meaningful for our family's future. David was initially skeptical when I shared the idea with him during a weekend morning walk through our Cedar Park neighborhood. "Rachel, I appreciate that you want to help, but starting a business is a huge risk. We have the kids to think about, and my salary at TechFlow is our primary income." "That's exactly why this could work," I replied, my excitement building as I articulated the vision. "You have inside knowledge of what corporate training programs lack. I have the expertise and network to build something better. And we have personal experience with the discrimination that many professionals face but rarely discuss openly." Over the following days, I developed a more detailed business plan. The leadership development industry in Austin was dominated by large impersonal firms that offered generic programs to corporate clients. There was room for a boutique company that specialized in innovative, personalized approaches to professional development. My former network included dozens of potential clients who had expressed frustration with traditional training providers. The financial projections were encouraging. With my background and reputation, I could likely secure several anchor clients within the first year. The overhead costs would be manageable if I started with a home-based operation and gradually expanded. Most importantly, the potential return on investment was significant, especially if I could develop proprietary training methodologies that differentiated my services from competitors. By October, I had made my decision. I would start Thompson Leadership Solutions, a company that would specialize in developing leadership skills for professionals facing career obstacles due to discrimination, bias, or non-traditional career paths. The company would serve as both a business venture and a form of strategic activism, demonstrating that diverse perspectives and experiences were assets rather than liabilities in leadership development. The timing felt perfect. David's fourth application for the Executive Leadership Development Program would be submitted in January. Whether he was accepted or rejected, my company would be positioned to capitalize on the outcome. If he was finally selected, we would have inside intelligence about TechFlow's program that could inform competitive strategies. If he was rejected again, we would have clear evidence of ongoing discrimination that could be leveraged for both legal action and marketing purposes. I spent the holidays developing curriculum, reaching out to potential clients, and establishing the legal and financial framework for the business. David remained cautiously supportive, particularly as he saw my energy and confidence returning after years of frustration with his career stagnation. By New Year's Eve, Thompson Leadership Solutions existed on paper, with a business license, a website under construction, and a growing list of potential clients who had expressed interest in my services. The fourth rejection letter arrived on Valentine's Day, a cruel irony that wasn't lost on either of us. This time, however, instead of devastation, I felt vindication. Robert Mitchell and his selection committee had just provided me with the final piece of evidence I needed to demonstrate their discriminatory practices. More importantly, they had given me the motivation to transform my business plan from a possibility into an urgent necessity. David found me that evening in our home office, surrounded by legal documents, business plans, and marketing materials. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice carrying both concern and hope. I looked up at him, this brilliant man whose career had been systematically undermined by small-minded individuals who couldn't see past their own biases. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," I replied. "They want to keep us down because they're threatened by what we represent together. It's time to show them exactly what they've been missing." The morning after David's fourth rejection, I woke up with a clarity of purpose that I hadn't felt since leaving TechFlow. While David got ready for another day at a company that refused to recognize his potential, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and began mapping out my investigation strategy. If I was going to build a case against TechFlow's discriminatory practices, I needed more than anecdotal evidence and suspicious patterns. I needed documentation, witness statements, and a comprehensive understanding of how their selection process actually worked behind closed doors. My first call was to Marcus Johnson. As a consultant who specialized in organizational behavior and had worked with dozens of companies on diversity and inclusion initiatives, he understood the legal landscape around employment discrimination better than almost anyone I knew. When I explained what I had discovered about the selection committee's discussions regarding David, his response was immediate and decisive. "Rachel, what you're describing isn't just unfair, it's actionable," Marcus said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen these situations play out in courtrooms. "Spousal discrimination is a recognized form of gender discrimination under federal employment law. If you can prove that David's marriage to you was a factor in his rejections, you have the foundation for a strong case." Marcus explained that the key would be establishing a paper trail that demonstrated the discriminatory intent. Selection committee minutes, email communications, performance reviews that contradicted rejection decisions, and comparative analysis of selected versus rejected candidates would all be crucial pieces of evidence. He also warned me about the challenges we would face. "Companies like TechFlow have learned to be subtle about this kind of discrimination," he cautioned. "They'll never put overtly discriminatory language in writing, and they'll always have alternative explanations for their decisions. You'll need to build a pattern of evidence that makes their bias undeniable." Over the following week, I reached out to other contacts in the corporate training world, carefully probing for information about TechFlow's reputation and practices. What I discovered painted a picture of a company that talked about diversity and inclusion in their marketing materials, but maintained a deeply traditional, male-dominated leadership culture and practice. Sarah Williams, a former colleague who now worked for a competing consulting firm, provided particularly valuable insights during a lunch meeting at a quiet restaurant in downtown Austin. She had bid on several training contracts with TechFlow over the past 2 years and had been struck by the homogeneity of their leadership team. Every meeting I attended was the same, Sarah told me, as we sat in a corner booth, speaking in low voices about sensitive corporate information. White men in their 40s and 50s, talking about maintaining company culture and ensuring that new leaders would fit their existing team dynamics. There was always this underlying message that they were looking for people who would perpetuate their existing systems, rather than challenge or change them. Sarah's observations aligned perfectly with what I was learning about the Executive Leadership Development Program. The selection criteria officially emphasized innovation, leadership potential, and strategic thinking. In practice, the program seemed designed to identify and promote individuals who would maintain TechFlow's existing power structure rather than diversify it. Armed with this growing understanding of TechFlow's organizational culture, I began developing a more sophisticated strategy for gathering evidence. Jessica Martinez remained my primary inside source, but I needed to be careful not to put her career at risk by asking for information that could be traced back to her. Instead, I focused on publicly available information and details that could be obtained through legitimate channels. The company's annual diversity reports, filed with various regulatory agencies, provided a wealth of data about their hiring and promotion practices. While TechFlow claimed to prioritize diversity in their public statements, their leadership demographics told a different story. Over the past 5 years, promotions to senior management positions had been overwhelmingly awarded to men, and the few women who had advanced were either single or married to men who worked for other companies. I spent hours analyzing the LinkedIn profiles of TechFlow's senior leadership, looking for patterns in their career trajectories, educational backgrounds, and personal circumstances. What emerged was a clear picture of a company that promoted people who fit a very specific profile: ambitious, traditionally educated, and unencumbered by personal relationships that might create competing loyalties or perceived conflicts of interest. The most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. While researching TechFlow's client relationships, I discovered that they had lost several major accounts over the past 2 years due to concerns about their lack of diversity in project leadership. One client, a progressive technology company based in San Francisco, had specifically cited TechFlow's homogeneous leadership team as a factor in their decision to switch to a different consulting firm. This information was publicly available through industry publications and client testimonials, but it painted a clear picture of a company whose discriminatory practices were beginning to have real business consequences. TechFlow's resistance to promoting diverse leaders wasn't just morally problematic, it was becoming a competitive disadvantage in a marketplace that increasingly valued inclusive leadership. As I gathered this evidence, I also began developing the business plan for Thompson Leadership Solutions in earnest. The discrimination case against TechFlow would provide motivation and potentially financial resources through a settlement, but the leadership training company would be my long-term strategy for creating systemic change in the industry. The market research was encouraging. Austin's business community was experiencing rapid growth, with dozens of new companies establishing operations in the area every month. Many of these organizations were founded by entrepreneurs who valued diversity and innovation over traditional corporate hierarchies. They represented a natural market for leadership development services that emphasized inclusive management practices and non-traditional career paths. I began reaching out to potential clients, using my existing network to schedule informal conversations about their leadership development needs. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Company after company expressed frustration with generic training programs that failed to address the unique challenges facing diverse teams and innovative business models. Rebecca Martinez, the founder of a successful Austin-based software company, exemplified the kind of client I hope to serve. During our meeting at a trendy coffee shop in South Austin, she described her struggles with traditional corporate training providers. Every program we've tried feels like it was designed for Fortune 500 companies from the 1990s. Rebecca explained, her frustration evident in her voice. They assume all our managers are men with stay-at-home wives who can work 60-hour weeks without any personal responsibilities. That's not our reality. Half our leadership team are working parents, and many of them took non-traditional paths to management roles. Rebecca's company had grown from a startup to a 100-employee organization in just 3 years, but she was struggling to develop leadership skills among her rapidly promoted managers. Traditional training programs either assumed too much prior management experience or focused on outdated leadership models that didn't fit her company's collaborative, flexible culture. What we need, Rebecca continued, is training that acknowledges the realities of modern work life and helps our leaders succeed without burning out or sacrificing their personal values. I'd pay premium rates for that kind of program. Similar conversations with other potential clients confirmed that there was a significant market opportunity for innovative leadership development services. The key would be developing proprietary methodologies that addressed the specific challenges facing contemporary leaders, while demonstrating measurable results that justified premium pricing. I spent evenings and weekends researching the latest developments in leadership psychology, adult learning theory, and organizational behavior. The academic literature was full of insights about effective leadership practices that hadn't yet been translated into practical corporate training programs. There was a clear opportunity to bridge the gap between cutting-edge research and real-world application. The curriculum I began developing for Thompson Leadership Solutions focused on 3 core areas: adaptive leadership for rapidly changing environments, inclusive management practices for diverse teams, and work-life integration strategies for sustainable career growth. Each module would combine theoretical frameworks with practical exercises and ongoing coaching support. What differentiated my approach from existing programs was the emphasis on personalized development paths that acknowledged the diverse backgrounds and circumstances of modern leaders. Rather than assuming all participants shared similar career trajectories and personal situations, my programs would be designed to help individuals leverage their unique experiences and perspectives as leadership strengths. The financial projections for the business were encouraging. Based on market research and preliminary conversations with potential clients, I estimated that Thompson Leadership Solutions could generate 6-figure revenue within the first year, scaling to 7 figures within 3 years if the market responded as anticipated. The profit margins for consulting services were attractive, particularly for specialized programs that commanded premium pricing. More importantly, the business model aligned perfectly with my personal mission of creating systemic change in corporate leadership culture. Every client who experienced success with inclusive leadership practices would become an advocate for diversity and innovation in their own organization. The ripple effects could extend far beyond my direct
Client base. As spring arrived, I made the decision to formally launch Thompson Leadership Solutions while simultaneously pursuing the discrimination case against TechFlow. The 2 strategies would reinforce each other. The legal case would provide credibility and publicity for my consulting services, while the success of my business would demonstrate the value of diverse leadership perspectives that companies like TechFlow were systematically excluding. David remained supportive but cautious about the timeline and financial risks involved in starting a new business. His concerns were legitimate. We had 2 young children, a mortgage, and significant financial obligations. Starting a consulting business would require upfront investment in marketing, technology, and business development before generating meaningful revenue. I believe in what you're trying to do, David told me during one of our evening conversations about the business plan. But I'm worried about the financial pressure and the time commitment. You're talking about building a company from scratch while also pursuing a legal case against my current employer. That's a lot of stress for our family. His concerns forced me to think more strategically about resource allocation and timeline management. I decided to phase the business launch in stages, starting with a few anchor clients who could provide immediate revenue while I developed more comprehensive program offerings. The discrimination case would proceed on a parallel track with the potential for a settlement that could provide capital for business expansion. The key was finding the right legal representation. Marcus Johnson recommended several employment attorneys who specialized in discrimination cases, but I wanted someone who understood both the legal aspects and the business implications of what I was trying to accomplish. After interviewing several candidates, I chose Amanda Foster, a partner at a prestigious Austin law firm who had successfully litigated dozens of employment discrimination cases. Amanda's approach was methodical and strategic. During our initial consultation, she reviewed all the evidence I had gathered and outlined a comprehensive strategy for building the strongest possible case against TechFlow. Her assessment was encouraging. The pattern of discrimination was clear, and the documentation I had assembled provided a solid foundation for legal action. The challenge won't be proving that discrimination occurred. Amanda explained during our meeting in her downtown Austin office. The challenge will be demonstrating that it was intentional and systematic rather than coincidental. We need to show that David's rejections were part of a broader pattern of bias rather than isolated incidents. Amanda's legal strategy complemented my business development plans perfectly. The discrimination case would proceed through formal channels, building pressure on TechFlow to address their practices while creating publicity that could benefit Thompson Leadership Solutions. Meanwhile, I would focus on client acquisition and program development, establishing credibility in the market before the legal case reached its conclusion. By the end of March, all the pieces were in place. Thompson Leadership Solutions had its first 3 clients signed, with program launches scheduled for late spring. The discrimination case against TechFlow was moving forward through formal legal channels, with Amanda filing initial complaints with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. David had decided to remain at TechFlow during the legal proceedings, both to maintain our family's financial stability and to gather additional evidence of discriminatory practices. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test everything I had learned about corporate politics, legal strategy, and business development. TechFlow's leadership had no idea that their systematic discrimination against David was about to become the catalyst for a direct challenge to their market position in Austin's leadership development industry. What they were about to discover was that excluding talented people from opportunities doesn't make those people disappear. It motivates them to create their own opportunities and to compete directly with the organizations that underestimated them. David's repeated rejections from the Executive Leadership Development Program hadn't ended his leadership potential, they had simply redirected it toward an outcome that TechFlow's narrow-minded selection committee had never anticipated. The irony was about to become deliciously apparent. By trying to prevent David from accessing leadership development opportunities, Robert Mitchell and his colleagues had inadvertently created the conditions for me to become their primary competitor in the Austin market. Their discrimination hadn't protected their boys' club, it had motivated the creation of a more innovative, inclusive alternative that would challenge their relevance in an evolving business landscape. As I finalized the last details of my business launch strategy, I couldn't help but smile at the poetic justice of the situation. TechFlow had spent years trying to maintain their traditional power structure by excluding people who didn't fit their preferred profile. What they were about to learn was that the future belonged to organizations that embraced diverse perspectives and innovative approaches to leadership development. Their loss was about to become my gain, and the Austin business community was about to benefit from competition that prioritized inclusion over exclusion, innovation over tradition, and results over politics. The Executive Leadership Development Program that had rejected David 4 times was about to face its first real competitor, and that competitor was going to be led by the woman they had tried so hard to marginalize. The game was about to change, and I held all the cards. The phone call that changed everything came on a Tuesday morning in April, while I was reviewing client proposals at my kitchen table. David's voice was tight with controlled anger, a tone I had rarely heard from him in our 8 years of marriage. He was calling from his car in the TechFlow parking garage, having just left what he described as the most humiliating meeting of his professional life. "Rachel, you need to hear this," David said, his words coming fast and sharp. "I just had my quarterly review with Lisa, and she told me something that changes everything we thought we knew about these program rejections." I set down my coffee and gave him my full attention. David had been preparing for this review for weeks, hoping to get clearer feedback about his prospects for the upcoming year's leadership program application. What he learned instead was far more damaging than we had imagined. "Lisa pulled me aside after the formal review," David continued, "and she told me that Robert Mitchell has been actively campaigning against my inclusion in the leadership program. Not just expressing concerns or raising questions, but actually lobbying other committee members to reject my applications." The news hit me like a physical blow. We had suspected bias and discrimination, but this revelation indicated active sabotage of David's career by someone in a position of authority. Lisa Rodriguez had always been supportive of David's professional development, and her decision to share this information suggested that she was troubled by what she had witnessed in selection committee meetings. "What exactly did she say?" I asked, grabbing a notebook to capture every detail of this conversation. David took a deep breath before continuing. "She said that during the most recent selection meeting, Robert argued that promoting me would send the wrong message about career advancement at TechFlow. He specifically mentioned that I had benefited from nepotism when you were in leadership, and that giving me access to the executive program would validate that perception." The irony was staggering. Robert Mitchell was accusing David of benefiting from nepotism while actively engaging in cronyism by protecting the advancement opportunities of his preferred candidates. More troubling was the fact that this discrimination was happening openly in committee meetings, suggesting that other senior leaders were either complicit or intimidated into silence. Lisa also told me that Robert has been questioning my commitment to the company, David added. He suggested that because you left to start your own business, I might be planning to leave as well. He's essentially arguing that I'm a flight risk who shouldn't receive investment in professional development. This new information transformed our understanding of the situation entirely. What we had interpreted as systemic bias was actually targeted harassment by a specific individual who had the power to influence David's career trajectory. Robert Mitchell wasn't just maintaining discriminatory policies, he was actively working to sabotage David's professional growth out of personal animosity toward me. Did Lisa say why she was telling you this? I asked, still processing the implications of these revelations. She said she couldn't ethically remain silent anymore. David replied. She believes that what Robert is doing is wrong and potentially illegal, but she's afraid to challenge him directly because he has significant influence with senior leadership. She suggested that we might want to consider formal action through HR or external channels. After David hung up to return to work, I sat in my kitchen staring at my notes from the conversation. Lisa's revelations provided the smoking gun evidence that Amanda Foster had said would be crucial for building a strong discrimination case. We now had a witness who could testify to explicit discriminatory statements made by a senior leader with direct influence over promotion decisions. More importantly, Robert Mitchell's behavior demonstrated that this wasn't just unconscious bias or institutional discrimination. This was personal retaliation motivated by his resentment of my former position at the company and his apparent belief that successful women threatened his authority. David was being punished specifically because he was married to someone who had once been Robert's professional superior. I immediately called Amanda Foster to share this new information. Her response was swift and decisive. This revelation moved our case from potentially winnable to almost certainly successful. Robert Mitchell's explicit statements about nepotism and David's supposed lack of commitment provided clear evidence of discriminatory intent that would be difficult for TechFlow to explain away. This changes our entire strategy, Amanda explained during our emergency phone consultation. We're no longer just alleging a pattern of discrimination, we're documenting specific discriminatory acts by a named individual. Robert Mitchell has essentially confessed to employment discrimination in front of witnesses. Amanda recommended that we move quickly to formalize our complaint while the evidence was fresh and before TechFlow had an opportunity to coach Robert or other committee members about their statements. She would file an amended complaint with the EEOC within the week, and she recommended that David document any further interactions with Robert or other senior leaders who might be involved in the discriminatory behavior. The legal implications were significant, but the personal impact was even more profound. David returned home that evening emotionally drained and angry in a way I had never seen before. The man who had always approached workplace challenges with patience and diplomacy was finally confronting the reality that his employer had been systematically undermining his career for years. I feel like such an idiot, David said as we sat on our back porch after putting the children to bed. All this time I thought I wasn't good enough, that I was missing something that would make me leadership material. Now I find out that none of it mattered because Robert decided years ago that I would never advance as long as he had any say in the matter. I reached for his hand, feeling the weight of guilt and anger that had been building in my chest since his phone call. This isn't your fault, and it's not about your qualifications or your worth as a professional. This is about Robert Mitchell's insecurity and his need to control who gets opportunities for advancement. But it is about you, David said quietly. If I hadn't married you, if you hadn't worked at TechFlow, none of this would be happening. My career is being destroyed because of our relationship. The pain in his voice was devastating. For years David had internalized the rejections as personal failures, questioning his own abilities and potential. Now he was blaming our marriage for his professional struggles, and I could see how this revelation was shaking his confidence in ways that went far beyond career concerns. Our relationship isn't the problem, I said firmly. Robert Mitchell's inability to separate personal resentment from professional judgment is the problem. You're not being punished for marrying me, you're being punished for threatening his sense of control over the company hierarchy. Over the following days, I found myself consumed with anger and determination in equal measure.
Robert Mitchell had not only damaged David's career and self-confidence, he had attacked our marriage and family stability. His discrimination wasn't just a professional matter, it was personal warfare disguised as corporate decision-making. The anger was productive, however, because it crystallized my commitment to both the legal case and the business strategy that would ultimately hold Robert and TechFlow accountable for their actions. Thompson Leadership Solutions wasn't just a business venture anymore, it was a direct challenge to the discriminatory practices and narrow-minded leadership that Robert represented. I spent the remainder of April accelerating the development of my leadership training programs while Amanda Foster built our legal case. The two strategies were beginning to converge in powerful ways. Every piece of evidence we gathered about TechFlow's discriminatory practices informed my understanding of the market opportunity for inclusive leadership development services. The first major breakthrough came when Jessica Martinez provided additional information about Robert Mitchell's statements during selection committee meetings. Through careful questioning during our regular coffee meetings, I learned that Robert's opposition to David wasn't limited to concerns about nepotism or commitment. He had also made disparaging comments about working parents and dual-career couples that revealed broader biases against non-traditional career paths. Robert has said multiple times that the leadership program should focus on candidates who can make full-time commitments to career advancement. Jessica told me during one of our discreet conversations. He's argued that people with working spouses or young children are distracted from their professional responsibilities and shouldn't receive premium development opportunities. This information was devastating for Robert's position but invaluable for our case. His statements demonstrated that the discrimination against David was part of a broader pattern of bias against employees who didn't conform to traditional family structures. TechFlow was systematically excluding talented professionals based on personal circumstances that had no bearing on their ability to perform or lead effectively. More importantly for my business strategy, Robert's comments revealed the mindset that was limiting TechFlow's ability to develop diverse leadership talent. Their executive development program was explicitly designed to serve a narrow demographic, ambitious men with stay-at-home spouses who could dedicate unlimited time to career advancement. This approach excluded not only women and working parents, but also anyone who valued work-life balance or had personal responsibilities outside of their professional ambitions. Thompson Leadership Solutions was positioned to serve exactly the market that TechFlow was systematically ignoring. My programs were designed for working parents, dual-career couples, and professionals who wanted to advance their careers without sacrificing their personal values or family commitments. What TechFlow saw as disqualifying characteristics, I saw as valuable perspectives that enhanced leadership effectiveness. The market validation for this approach came sooner than I had anticipated. Rebecca Martinez, the software company founder who had expressed interest in my services, became my first major client in May. Her company signed a 6-month contract for comprehensive leadership development programming that would serve 25 managers across multiple departments. "Your approach is exactly what we've been looking for," Rebecca told me during our contract signing meeting. "We want leaders who can be effective without burning out, who can manage diverse teams with empathy and flexibility, and who can model sustainable career practices for our employees." Traditional leadership programs seem designed to create workaholics rather than effective managers. Rebecca's contract provided immediate validation for my business model and generated substantial revenue that allowed me to invest in marketing and program development. More importantly, it demonstrated that there was real market demand for leadership development services that addressed the challenges facing contemporary professionals. The success with Rebecca's company also provided powerful ammunition for our legal case against TechFlow. Here was concrete evidence that inclusive leadership practices generated business value, contradicting Robert Mitchell's assumptions about the limitations of non-traditional leaders. Companies were actively seeking diverse leadership perspectives and paying premium rates for development programs that embraced rather than excluded working parents and dual-career couples. As spring turned to summer, I found myself juggling multiple demanding projects simultaneously. Thompson Leadership Solutions was growing rapidly, with 3 major clients signed and several more in advanced negotiations. The legal case against TechFlow was progressing through EEOC proceedings, with Amanda Foster building a comprehensive file of evidence documenting the pattern of discrimination. And David was continuing to work at TechFlow while documenting additional instances of bias and retaliation. The stress was significant, but so was the sense of momentum and purpose. For the first time since leaving TechFlow years earlier, I felt like I was operating at the peak of my professional capabilities while also working toward meaningful change in corporate culture.
Every client's success reinforced my conviction that inclusive leadership development was not just morally right but also strategically advantageous for forward-thinking organizations. The personal costs were real, however. Managing a growing business while pursuing legal action required long hours and constant attention to detail. David was dealing with increasing tension at work as word spread about the EEOC complaint and Robert Mitchell's role in the discrimination. Our children were spending more time with babysitters and family members as both of us focused on professional responsibilities that seemed to expand daily. The breaking point came in late June when David called me from his office with news that Robert Mitchell had scheduled a meeting to discuss David's future at TechFlow. The meeting was positioned as a routine career development conversation, but the timing suggested retaliation for our legal action. David was being summoned to account for his professional plans just weeks after filing formal discrimination complaints. "I think they're planning to fire me," David said during our hurried phone conversation. Robert scheduled this meeting immediately after HR told him about the EEOC complaint. "They probably want to create a paper trail justifying my termination before the investigation proceeds too far." The prospect of David losing his job was both terrifying and liberating. Our family depended on his salary for basic expenses, and losing that income would create immediate financial pressure. At the same time, his termination would provide additional evidence of retaliation that would strengthen our legal case and potentially lead to a significant settlement. "Whatever happens in that meeting, document everything," I told David. "Record it if Texas law allows, take detailed notes, and make sure you have witnesses if possible. If they're planning retaliation, we need evidence that will hold up in court." David's meeting with Robert Mitchell was scheduled for the following morning. That evening, we sat our children down for a difficult conversation about the possibility of significant changes in our family's circumstances. Emma and Michael were old enough to understand that Daddy might lose his job because of unfair treatment at work and that Mommy's new business might become our primary source of income. "Are we going to be okay?" Emma asked with the directness that 8-year-olds bring to serious conversations. "We're going to be better than okay," I told her, meaning every word. "Sometimes when bad things happen, they create opportunities for even better things. Daddy's company made a mistake by not treating him fairly, and now we're going to show them how much they're missing." That night, as David and I reviewed our financial situation and contingency plans, I felt a sense of calm determination that surprised me. The confrontation we had been building toward for months was finally arriving, and I was ready for whatever Robert Mitchell and TechFlow wanted to throw at us. Their discrimination had created Thompson Leadership Solutions. Their retaliation was about to make my business even more successful and their legal liability even more extensive. Robert Mitchell thought he was protecting his authority by attacking our family, but he was actually accelerating his own professional downfall while providing me with the motivation and market opportunity to build something far more valuable than anything TechFlow could offer. The war was about to begin, and I had been preparing for this battle for months. David's meeting with Robert Mitchell lasted exactly 37 minutes, and by the time it was over, our lives had changed forever. David called me from the parking garage immediately afterward, his voice carrying a mixture of shock, relief, and barely contained excitement that I had never heard before. "Rachel, you're not going to believe what just happened," David began, and I could hear the adrenaline in his voice. "Robert just offered me immediate admission to the Executive Leadership Development Program." I nearly dropped my phone. After 4 years of rejections and months of documented discrimination, Robert Mitchell was suddenly reversing course completely. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental, coming just one day after TechFlow's legal department had been formally notified of our EEOC complaint. "What exactly did he say?" I asked, grabbing my notebook to capture every detail of this unexpected development. David's account of the meeting revealed Robert Mitchell in full damage control mode. The conversation had begun with Robert expressing concern about David's career satisfaction and professional development goals. He had claimed that previous rejections from the leadership program had been due to budget constraints and program capacity limitations, not any reflection on David's qualifications or potential. He said that a spot had opened up in this year's cohort due to an unexpected resignation. David explained, and that the selection committee had immediately thought of me as the ideal replacement candidate. He made it sound like they'd been waiting for an opportunity to include me all along. The transparent attempt at revisionist history would have been amusing if it weren't so insulting to our intelligence. Robert was clearly hoping that offering David the program admission would make our discrimination complaint disappear and prevent further legal action.
What he didn't realize was that his sudden reversal actually strengthened our case by demonstrating that David had always been qualified for the program and that previous rejections had indeed been discriminatory. Did he mention the EEOC complaint or our legal action? I asked, not directly. David replied, but he kept emphasizing how much TechFlow values diversity and inclusion and how important it is for the company to provide equal opportunities for all employees. It was obvious that he knew exactly why he was suddenly offering me the program. David had handled the meeting perfectly, expressing appreciation for the opportunity while avoiding any statements that could be interpreted as accepting Robert's revisionist explanation for the previous rejections. He had asked for 24 hours to consider the offer, which would give us time to discuss the implications with Amanda Foster before responding. The drive home from my office gave me time to process this unexpected turn of events. Robert's offer created both opportunities and complications for our legal strategy. On one hand, his sudden reversal provided compelling evidence that David had always been qualified for the program and that previous rejections had been discriminatory. On the other hand, accepting the program admission might weaken our position in arguing for damages related to David's stunted career advancement. More importantly, this development forced us to confront a fundamental question about our long-term goals. Did we want David to advance within TechFlow's existing system, or were we committed to the transformational path we had been building through Thompson Leadership Solutions and the discrimination lawsuit? Amanda Foster's advice was characteristically strategic when I called to brief her on Robert's offer. "This is actually perfect for our case," she explained. "His sudden willingness to admit David proves that our discrimination allegations are valid. No one reverses years of rejection decisions unless they're trying to avoid legal liability." Amanda recommended that David accept the program admission while we continued pursuing the discrimination case. The acceptance wouldn't prevent us from seeking damages for the years of discriminatory treatment, and David's participation in the program would provide additional evidence about TechFlow's leadership development practices that could strengthen our case. Plus, Amanda added with satisfaction evident in her voice, having David in their flagship program while we're suing them for discrimination will be deeply uncomfortable for Robert Mitchell and the other executives involved. They'll have to treat him fairly while knowing that we're documenting every interaction for potential use in litigation. That evening, David and I had the most important conversation of our marriage to that point. The decision about whether to accept Robert's offer would determine not just David's career trajectory but the future direction of our family and my business. We sat on our back porch with a bottle of wine, watching our children play in the yard while we discussed options that seemed almost surreal compared to our situation just months earlier. "Part of me wants to reject his offer just to prove a point," David admitted. "After years of being told I wasn't good enough, it's insulting to have him suddenly pretend that none of that history happened." I understood his frustration, but I also saw the strategic value of accepting the program while maintaining our legal action. "Think about this," I said. "You'll be participating in their most prestigious development program while we're proving in court that they discriminated against you for years. You'll have access to their training methods, their client relationships, and their strategic planning processes. That information could be invaluable for Thompson Leadership Solutions." The competitive intelligence aspect was compelling, but the personal satisfaction element was even more attractive. David would be sitting in meetings with Robert Mitchell and other senior leaders who had actively worked to exclude him, forced to treat him as a valued future leader while knowing that their discriminatory behavior was being scrutinized by federal investigators. There's also the message it sends to other TechFlow employees who might be facing similar discrimination, I continued. "If we can prove that they only offered you this opportunity because of legal pressure, it demonstrates that challenging discrimination can produce real results." David made his decision the next morning. He would accept admission to the Executive Leadership Development Program while we continued
pursuing our legal case for the years of discriminatory treatment he had endured. Robert Mitchell's attempt to buy our silence had backfired spectacularly, giving us exactly what we wanted while strengthening our legal position. The next several months unfolded with a momentum that surprised even me. David's participation in the leadership program provided fascinating insights into TechFlow's corporate culture and strategic thinking, much of which informed the competitive positioning of Thompson Leadership Solutions. Meanwhile, my business was experiencing rapid growth as word spread about our innovative approach to professional development. The breakthrough moment for Thompson Leadership Solutions came in August when I received a call from the CEO of Austin's largest technology company. They had heard about my work through Rebecca Martinez and wanted to discuss a comprehensive leadership development partnership that would serve over 200 managers across multiple divisions. "We've been watching what you're doing with inclusive leadership practices," the CEO told me during our initial meeting, "and we're convinced that this approach represents the future of corporate management. We want to be early adopters of methodologies that will give us a competitive advantage in attracting and retaining diverse talent." The contract negotiation took 3 weeks and resulted in a seven-figure agreement that established Thompson Leadership Solutions as a major player in Austin's corporate training market. More importantly, the partnership provided a platform for demonstrating the business value of inclusive leadership practices on a scale that would be impossible to ignore. The irony wasn't lost on me that TechFlow had been invited to bid on the same contract but had been eliminated from consideration early in the process. Their traditional approach to leadership development was increasingly seen as outdated by forward-thinking companies that valued innovation over hierarchy and inclusion over exclusion. Robert Mitchell's world was shrinking while mine was expanding, and the contrast became more apparent every week. David reported that the leadership program was struggling with outdated curriculum and disconnected training modules that failed to address the real challenges facing contemporary managers. Meanwhile, Thompson Leadership Solutions was being featured in business publications as an example of innovative corporate education that produced measurable results. The legal case reached its climax in October when TechFlow's attorneys approached Amanda Foster about settlement negotiations. The company was facing increasing pressure from the EEOC investigation, and the publicity surrounding our case was beginning to affect their ability to recruit top talent and retain key clients. "They want to settle quickly and quietly," Amanda reported during our meeting to discuss their initial offer. "The number they've proposed is significant, but more importantly, they're willing to agree to substantial changes in their promotion and development practices as part of the settlement agreement." The financial settlement was larger than I had anticipated, but the systemic changes were even more valuable. TechFlow agreed to revise their executive leadership development program selection criteria to eliminate bias against employees with working spouses or non-traditional family structures. They also committed to external auditing of their promotion practices and mandatory bias training for all managers involved in advancement decisions. Most satisfying of all, Robert Mitchell was required to participate in a comprehensive diversity and inclusion training program, with his completion of the program and adherence to non-discriminatory practices made explicit conditions of his continued employment. The man who had spent years undermining David's career was now being forced to confront his own biases under the threat of termination. David completed the Executive Leadership Development Program in November, graduating with honors and receiving offers for senior management positions both within TechFlow and from competing companies. The program that had rejected him 4 times ultimately became the platform for demonstrating his exceptional leadership potential to a broader market. The graduation ceremony was held at a luxury hotel in downtown Austin, with senior executives from across the city attending to celebrate the achievements of that year's cohort. I attended as David's guest but also as the founder of a leadership development company that was increasingly seen as TechFlow's primary competitor in the local market. Robert Mitchell was forced to present David with his certificate of completion, shaking hands and offering congratulations while photographers captured the moment for company publications. The irony was exquisite. The man who had actively worked to prevent David's advancement was now publicly celebrating his leadership potential in front of an audience that included several of my current and prospective clients. "Congratulations on completing our program," Robert said with a forced smile as he handed David the certificate. "I'm confident you'll make valuable contributions to whatever organization is fortunate enough to benefit from your leadership." The subtext was clear. Robert hoped that David would take his newly enhanced qualifications and leave TechFlow for another company. What Robert didn't realize was that David had already made that decision, and his new position would be as Chief Operating Officer of Thompson Leadership Solutions. David's transition from TechFlow employee to business partner represented the final transformation in our journey from discrimination victims to industry leaders. His insider knowledge of corporate training practices, combined with my expertise in curriculum development and client relationships, created a partnership that was immediately profitable and strategically positioned for continued growth. The announcement of David's new role generated significant attention in Austin's business community, with several publications covering the story of how employment discrimination had inadvertently created TechFlow's most successful competitor. The narrative resonated with professionals who had experienced similar challenges and with companies that were seeking alternatives to traditional leadership development providers.
Sometimes the best thing that can happen to talented people is being rejected by organizations that don't deserve them. I told a reporter from the Austin Business Journal who was writing about our company's rapid growth. TechFlow's discrimination didn't destroy David's career, it redirected his talents toward building something much more valuable than anything they could have offered him. 6 months later, Thompson Leadership Solutions had grown to 15 employees and was serving clients across 3 states. Our methodology had been featured in Harvard Business Review, and we were receiving speaking invitations from conferences across the country. The company that had started as a response to discrimination had become a nationally recognized leader in innovative corporate education. The personal transformation was equally profound. David had evolved from a frustrated middle manager, questioning his own abilities, to a confident executive leading organizational change initiatives for major corporations. I had rediscovered my professional passion while building a business that aligned with my values and generated significant financial returns. Most importantly, our marriage had emerged stronger from the challenges we had faced together. The discrimination that could have divided us had instead united us around a shared mission of creating systemic change in corporate culture. We were no longer just husband and wife, we were business partners committed to demonstrating that diverse perspectives and inclusive practices generated superior results. The children adapted to our new circumstances with resilience that amazed me. Emma and Michael took pride in telling their friends that Mommy and Daddy had started a company together, and they seemed to understand instinctively that our family's challenges had led to opportunities that wouldn't have existed otherwise. Looking back on the journey from David's first rejection letter to the success of Thompson Leadership Solutions, I'm struck by the unexpected ways that adversity can create opportunity. Robert Mitchell's discrimination was intended to limit our professional options and maintain his control over advancement opportunities at TechFlow. Instead, it motivated us to create alternatives that ultimately made his approach obsolete. The leadership development industry in Austin was transformed by our success, with other companies adopting inclusive practices and innovative methodologies to compete with our growing market share. TechFlow's traditional approach became increasingly marginalized as clients sought providers who understood the realities of contemporary professional life. Robert Mitchell remained at TechFlow, but his influence diminished as the company struggled to compete with more innovative competitors. The executive who had once held David's career in his hands was now managing declining market share and client defections to companies that embraced the diverse leadership perspectives he had systematically excluded. The final vindication came 18 months after David's graduation from the Executive Leadership Development Program, when TechFlow approached Thompson Leadership Solutions about a potential partnership to modernize their corporate training offerings. The company that had discriminated against us was now seeking our expertise to remain relevant in a market we had helped reshape. It's ironic, David observed during our discussion about whether to accept TechFlow's partnership proposal. They spent years trying to prevent me from accessing their leadership development resources. Now they want to pay us to teach them how to develop leaders effectively. We ultimately declined their partnership offer, not out of spite, but because our client roster was full and we had more profitable opportunities with companies that shared our values from the beginning. TechFlow's belated recognition of our expertise was satisfying, but not enough to overcome the years of discrimination and the fundamental cultural differences that would make collaboration difficult. Instead, we continued building Thompson Leadership Solutions into the company we had always envisioned, a place where talented professionals could develop their leadership potential regardless of their personal circumstances or career backgrounds. Our success demonstrated that inclusive practices weren't just morally right, they were strategically advantageous for organizations competing in an increasingly diverse marketplace. The story of how employment discrimination led to entrepreneurial success became a case study taught in business schools and diversity training programs across the country. Our experience illustrated both the costs of discriminatory practices and the opportunities created when talented people are motivated to build alternatives to exclusionary systems. Years later, when speaking at conferences about inclusive leadership and entrepreneurial success, I always emphasize the same point. Discrimination doesn't eliminate talented people from the marketplace, it motivates them to create their own opportunities. Organizations that exclude diverse perspectives aren't protecting their market position, they're creating competitive advantages for more innovative competitors. Robert Mitchell and TechFlow learned this lesson the hard way, watching their market share erode as clients migrated to providers who understood that the future belonged to inclusive leadership rather than exclusive hierarchies. Their attempt to maintain traditional power structures by discriminating against non-conforming employees had accelerated the very changes they were trying to prevent. Thompson Leadership Solutions continued to grow and thrive, serving as a daily reminder that the best response to discrimination isn't acceptance or resignation, but the creation of alternatives that make exclusionary practices obsolete. Sometimes the most powerful form of justice is success that makes your former oppressors irrelevant. The Executive Leadership Development Program that had rejected David 4 times was discontinued 3 years later due to declining enrollment and client complaints about outdated methodology. The program that had been TechFlow's flagship offering was replaced with more contemporary approaches that emphasized the inclusive practices Thompson Leadership Solutions had pioneered in the Austin market. David and I built something more valuable than anything TechFlow could have offered us, and we did it by refusing to accept their limitations as our own. Their discrimination became our motivation, their exclusion became our opportunity, and their loss became our gain. Sometimes the best revenge is a life well lived and a business that succeeds by embracing everything your oppressors tried to suppress. The morning I received the phone call that would forever cement our triumph over TechFlow's discriminatory practices began like any other Tuesday at Thompson Leadership Solutions. I was reviewing client progress reports in my corner office overlooking downtown Austin when my assistant buzzed through with an urgent call from Thomas Bradley, TechFlow's CEO. The man who had remained conspicuously silent during our legal battle was now personally reaching out, 18 months after our settlement, with what he described as a matter of critical importance. "Rachel, I hope you'll forgive the directness of this call," Thomas began, his voice carrying an undertone of desperation that I had never heard from him during our previous professional interactions. "I'm calling because TechFlow is facing a crisis that I believe only you and your team can help us resolve." The irony of the situation was immediately apparent. The company that had systematically discriminated against my husband and tried to marginalize my professional expertise was now seeking our assistance to save their reputation and market position. Thomas explained that TechFlow was facing a federal investigation into their employment practices following complaints from multiple employees about systemic discrimination in promotion and advancement opportunities. "The Department of Labor has identified patterns in our hiring and promotion data that mirror the issues raised in your case," Thomas continued, his corporate composure beginning to crack. "We're looking at potential sanctions that could affect our ability to compete for government contracts, and several major clients have suspended their relationships with us pending the outcome of the investigation." The investigation had been triggered by our successful lawsuit, which had encouraged other TechFlow employees to come forward with their own experiences of discrimination and bias. What had begun as David's individual case had evolved into a comprehensive examination of the company's employment practices spanning multiple departments and years of documented inequity. "I won't insult your intelligence by pretending that we haven't made serious mistakes," Thomas said, abandoning the corporate speak that had characterized our previous interactions. Robert Mitchell's behavior was inexcusable, and the cultural issues that enabled his discrimination run deeper than we initially realized. We need outside expertise to rebuild our employment practices and demonstrate genuine commitment to change. The request was extraordinary. TechFlow wanted Thompson Leadership Solutions to lead a comprehensive transformation of their corporate culture, employment practices, and leadership development programs. They were essentially asking the victims of their discrimination to become the architects of their rehabilitation, acknowledging that we possessed the expertise and credibility necessary to address problems they had created but couldn't solve independently. Thomas outlined the scope of the proposed engagement, which would involve conducting a complete audit of TechFlow's employment practices, redesigning their promotion and advancement systems, and implementing new leadership development programs based on the inclusive methodologies that had made Thompson Leadership Solutions successful. The financial terms were substantial, representing the largest single contract in our company's history. More significantly, the engagement would require TechFlow to publicly acknowledge the discriminatory practices that had led to our lawsuit and to implement changes that would serve as a model for other companies facing similar challenges. They were offering us the opportunity to transform the organization that had once tried to destroy David's career into a showcase for inclusive employment practices. David and I discussed Thomas's proposal during a long walk through our Cedar Park neighborhood that evening. The financial opportunity was undeniable, but the personal and professional implications were complex. Working with TechFlow would require us to collaborate with people who had actively discriminated against us, including Robert Mitchell, who remained with the company despite his reduced influence and authority. Part of me wants to reject their offer just to watch them struggle with problems they created, David admitted as we paused at a neighborhood park where our children were playing. After everything they put us through, there's something satisfying about seeing them face consequences for their actions. I understood his sentiment, but I also recognized the broader opportunity that Thomas's proposal represented. Think about what we could accomplish, I said, watching Emma and Michael climb on playground equipment that we could now afford because of the success we had built despite TechFlow's attempts to limit our opportunities. We could transform the company that discriminated against us into a model for how organizations should treat all their employees. The strategic value of the engagement extended beyond the immediate financial benefits. Successfully transforming TechFlow's culture would establish Thompson Leadership Solutions as the premier consulting firm for organizational change and inclusive leadership development. Our success with such a high-profile, challenging client would generate publicity and credibility that would accelerate our expansion into national markets. More importantly, the project would allow us to create systemic change that could benefit thousands of current and future TechFlow employees. Rather than simply punishing the company for past discrimination, we would be building systems and practices that would prevent similar mistreatment of others. The transformation would serve as a case study demonstrating that discriminatory organizations could be reformed through comprehensive intervention and committed leadership. After discussing the proposal with our legal counsel and business advisors, David and I decided to accept Thomas's offer with specific conditions designed to ensure our authority and protect our interests. TechFlow would publicly acknowledge our expertise and the legitimacy of our discrimination claims, provide us with complete authority over the transformation process, and commit to implementing all recommended changes regardless of internal resistance. Most importantly, Robert Mitchell would be required to participate fully in the transformation process, including sensitivity training and mentorship sessions designed to address the biases that had motivated his discriminatory behavior. The man who had spent years undermining David's career would now be obligated to learn from the people he had tried to marginalize, under the supervision of federal monitors and external auditors. The TechFlow engagement began in September with a comprehensive assessment of the company's employment practices, corporate culture, and leadership development systems. Our team spent weeks interviewing employees, reviewing personnel files, and analyzing promotion patterns to understand the full scope of discriminatory practices that had been embedded in the organization's operations. What we discovered was worse than even I had anticipated. The discrimination against David had been part of a systematic pattern affecting dozens of employees across multiple departments and demographic categories. Women, minorities, working parents, and employees with non-traditional backgrounds had all faced barriers to advancement that were rarely documented, but consistently applied through informal networks and subjective evaluation criteria. The most damaging evidence came from internal communications that revealed explicit discussions about maintaining cultural fit and protecting company traditions through careful selection of advancement candidates. Senior leaders had routinely discussed the desirability of promoting employees who fit established demographic profiles while expressing concerns about candidates who might disrupt existing power dynamics. Reading these emails is like getting a master class in how modern discrimination operates, David observed during one of our evening debriefing sessions. They never use overtly discriminatory language, but the intent is unmistakable when you see the patterns of decision-making over time. The assessment phase culminated in a presentation to TechFlow's board of directors outlining our findings and recommendations for comprehensive organizational reform. The presentation was held in the same conference room where Robert Mitchell had once argued against David's inclusion in leadership development programs, but now Robert was sitting silently while we detailed the extent of discriminatory practices that had flourished under his influence. The discrimination documented in this assessment represents a fundamental failure of leadership and organizational values. I told the board members, making direct eye contact with each executive as I outlined the scope of necessary changes. Transforming TechFlow's culture will require acknowledging these failures, accepting responsibility for their consequences, and committing to comprehensive reform that prioritizes equity and inclusion over traditional hierarchies. The board approved our transformation plan unanimously, authorizing a 2-year engagement that would touch every aspect of TechFlow's operations.
The scope of work included redesigning promotion criteria, implementing bias training for all managers, establishing employee resource groups, creating transparent advancement pathways, and developing new leadership programs based on inclusive methodologies. The implementation phase began with mandatory training sessions for all senior executives, including Robert Mitchell, who was required to complete an intensive program addressing unconscious bias, inclusive leadership practices, and legal compliance requirements. Watching Robert sit through presentations about the harmful effects of discrimination and the business benefits of diverse leadership was profoundly satisfying after years of enduring his prejudice and retaliation. "This is poetic justice," Jessica Martinez told me during one of our coffee meetings to discuss the transformation progress. Robert spent years lecturing people about company culture and appropriate behavior, and now he's being lectured about his own discriminatory practices by the people he tried to exclude. The transformation process was not without resistance from employees who had benefited from the previous discriminatory systems. Some senior managers expressed frustration with new accountability measures and transparent promotion processes that eliminated their ability to favor preferred candidates through subjective evaluation criteria. However, the federal oversight and public scrutiny surrounding the engagement made open opposition impossible. More importantly, the majority of TechFlow employees responded positively to the changes, particularly those who had previously faced barriers to advancement. The company's employee satisfaction scores improved dramatically as promotion processes became more transparent and merit-based advancement opportunities expanded to include previously marginalized groups. The success of our intervention became apparent within the first year of implementation. TechFlow's promotion demographics shifted significantly as qualified candidates who had been systematically excluded began advancing to leadership positions. The company's client satisfaction scores improved as diverse teams brought fresh perspectives to problem-solving and customer relations. Most significantly, TechFlow began attracting top talent who had previously avoided the company due to its reputation for discriminatory practices. The transformation we had implemented made TechFlow competitive in recruiting markets where inclusive culture and advancement opportunities were priorities for prospective employees. The financial impact was equally impressive. TechFlow's revenue grew by 30% during the first year of our engagement, as improved employee performance and innovative client solutions generated new business opportunities. The return on investment for our consulting services exceeded projections by substantial margins, proving that inclusive practices generated measurable business value. The transformation reached its symbolic climax when TechFlow launched a new executive leadership development program, designed according to our inclusive methodologies and open to all qualified employees regardless of personal circumstances or demographic characteristics. The program that had once excluded David now served as a model for equitable professional development that other companies began adopting. Robert Mitchell's participation in the new program was mandatory as part of his professional development requirements, creating the surreal situation of him learning leadership skills from curriculum that David and I had designed based on principles he had once opposed. The irony was not lost on anyone involved in the process, particularly Robert himself, who had been forced to confront the limitations of his previous worldview. "I owe you an apology," Robert told David during a one-on-one mentoring session that was part of his development plan. "I allowed my personal biases and insecurities to influence professional decisions in ways that were unfair and harmful. You deserved better treatment, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to learn from the mistakes I made." The apology was genuine, but came too late to repair the damage Robert had caused to David's confidence and career trajectory. However, it represented an acknowledgement of wrongdoing that validated our decision to challenge discriminatory practices rather than accepting them as unchangeable aspects of corporate culture. The 2-year TechFlow engagement concluded with a comprehensive evaluation demonstrating that our intervention had successfully transformed the company's employment practices and organizational culture. Employee satisfaction scores had reached historic highs, promotion demographics reflected workforce diversity, and client relationships had strengthened due to improved service quality from engaged diverse teams. The success of our work with TechFlow generated national attention and established Thompson Leadership Solutions as the premier consulting firm for organizational transformation and inclusive leadership development. We received inquiries from Fortune 500 companies seeking similar interventions, allowing us to expand our operations and impact across multiple industries and geographic markets. More importantly, the TechFlow case study became a model for how discriminatory organizations could be transformed through comprehensive intervention and committed leadership. Business schools began teaching our methodology as an example of effective organizational change management, and government agencies referenced our work when developing guidelines for addressing workplace discrimination. The personal transformation was equally profound. David had evolved from a victim of discrimination to a nationally recognized expert on inclusive leadership practices. His insights about the employee experience of bias and exclusion informed training programs that helped thousands of managers develop more equitable approaches to team leadership and professional development. Sometimes the best thing that can happen to you is being forced to build something better than what others denied you. David reflected during a speaking engagement about our transformation of TechFlow. Their discrimination didn't destroy my career potential, it redirected my talents toward creating opportunities for other people facing
similar challenges. My own professional journey had come full circle in unexpected ways. The leadership development expertise that Robert Mitchell had once dismissed as irrelevant had become the foundation for transforming his organization and career. The woman he had tried to marginalize through attacks on her husband had become his teacher and supervisor in learning inclusive leadership practices. Thompson Leadership Solutions had grown into a multi-million-dollar consulting firm with offices in 3 cities and clients across 2 countries. The company that had started as a response to discrimination had become a leading voice in organizational transformation and inclusive leadership development, proving that adversity could be transformed into opportunity through determination and strategic action. The children who had once worried about Daddy losing his job now took pride in telling friends that their parents had transformed the company that tried to hurt their family into a better organization for everyone. Emma and Michael had learned powerful lessons about standing up to injustice and creating positive change through their front-row view of our journey from discrimination victims to industry leaders. The broader impact of our work extended far beyond TechFlow or even our consulting practice. Other companies began proactively addressing discriminatory practices rather than waiting for legal action or federal intervention. The business case for inclusive leadership had been proven through measurable results that made discrimination not just morally wrong but strategically disadvantageous. 5 years after David's first rejection from the Executive Leadership Development Program, we were invited to speak at TechFlow's annual leadership conference about our transformation of the company's culture and practices. The invitation represented a complete reversal of our relationship with the organization that had once tried to limit our professional opportunities. Standing on the stage where Robert Mitchell had once delivered speeches about maintaining company culture and protecting traditional values, I addressed an audience that included many of the employees who had witnessed or experienced the discriminatory practices we had worked to eliminate. The symbolism was powerful. The woman whose husband had been excluded from leadership development was now teaching leadership principles to the executives who had perpetuated that exclusion. Transformation is possible when organizations commit to acknowledging past failures and implementing comprehensive change. I told the audience, which included Robert Mitchell sitting in the front row taking notes. TechFlow's journey from discrimination to inclusion demonstrates that companies can evolve beyond their historical limitations when they embrace diverse perspectives and equitable practices. The standing ovation that followed was more than polite corporate applause. It represented genuine appreciation from employees who had benefited from the changes we had implemented and recognition from leadership who had learned to value the inclusive practices they had once resisted. After the presentation, Thomas Bradley approached us privately to discuss the long-term impact of our work on TechFlow's success and reputation. The company had not only avoided the federal sanctions that had once threatened their government contracts but had actually won new business specifically because of their reputation for inclusive practices and innovative leadership development. Your transformation of our organization saved TechFlow in ways that go far beyond avoiding legal penalties, Thomas told us with genuine gratitude. We're now competitive in markets where diverse leadership and inclusive culture are prerequisites for client relationships. You didn't just fix our problems, you made us better than we ever were before. The conversation with Thomas highlighted the ultimate vindication of our approach to addressing discrimination through strategic action rather than passive acceptance. By building Thompson Leadership Solutions and transforming TechFlow, we had created more value and positive change than would have been possible through simply joining their original leadership program or accepting token concessions to make discrimination complaints disappear. Looking back on the journey from David's first rejection letter to our transformation of the company that had discriminated against us, I'm struck by the unexpected ways that apparent setbacks can become catalysts for extraordinary achievements. Robert Mitchell's discrimination was intended to maintain his authority and protect traditional power structures, but it actually accelerated changes that made his approach obsolete and irrelevant.
The leadership development industry in Austin and beyond had been permanently changed by our success in proving that inclusive practices generated superior results compared to exclusionary approaches. Companies that continued discriminatory practices found themselves at competitive disadvantages as clients and employees migrated to organizations that embraced diverse perspectives and equitable advancement opportunities. Robert Mitchell remained at TechFlow, but in a significantly diminished role focused on individual contributor responsibilities rather than leadership or hiring decisions. The executive who had once controlled David's career prospects was now subject to oversight and evaluation criteria designed to prevent the discriminatory behavior that had defined his previous management approach. The final validation came when the executive leadership development program that had rejected David 4 times was redesigned according to our inclusive methodologies and renamed the Thompson Bradley Leadership Institute in recognition of our transformation of TechFlow's approach to professional development. The program that had once excluded us now bore our name and reflected our values. It's ironic, David observed during the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the renamed program. They spent years trying to keep me out of their leadership development program, and now the program is named after us and designed according to our principles. Sometimes the best revenge is making your former oppressors adopt your values as their own. The success story of Thompson Leadership Solutions and our transformation of TechFlow became a case study taught in business schools and management programs around the world. Our experience illustrated both the costs of discriminatory practices and the opportunities created when talented people refuse to accept exclusion as permanent or unchangeable. Years later, when speaking at conferences about entrepreneurship and organizational change, I always emphasize the same fundamental principle. Discrimination doesn't eliminate talented people from consideration, it motivates them to create alternatives that make exclusionary practices obsolete. Organizations that exclude diverse perspectives aren't protecting their market position, they're creating competitive advantages for more innovative and inclusive competitors. The legacy of our journey extends beyond business success to the thousands of employees who have benefited from the inclusive practices we helped establish at TechFlow and other client organizations. Every person who has received fair consideration for advancement, every team that has benefited from diverse leadership, and every company that has improved performance through inclusive practices represents a victory over the discriminatory mindset that once tried to limit our potential. Thompson Leadership Solutions continues to grow and evolve, serving clients across multiple industries and countries who seek to build more inclusive and effective organizations. The company that started as a response to discrimination has become a global leader in transformation consulting, proving that positive change is possible when talented people refuse to accept limitations imposed by others. The children who once worried about their family's future now serve as inspiration for other young people facing adversity and discrimination. Emma and Michael learned that challenges can become opportunities when approached with determination, strategy, and commitment to creating positive change rather than simply accepting unfair treatment. Our story demonstrates that the most powerful response to discrimination isn't litigation or complaint, though those tools have their place, but the creation of alternatives that make exclusionary practices irrelevant and obsolete. Sometimes the best form of justice is success that transforms former oppressors into students learning principles they once opposed. Robert Mitchell and TechFlow learned this lesson the hard way, watching their traditional approach become marginalized as more inclusive and effective alternatives gained market dominance. Their attempt to maintain discriminatory practices by excluding talented people had actually accelerated the changes they were trying to prevent, creating the conditions for their own transformation and our ultimate victory. The Executive Leadership Development Program that once rejected David 4 times was eventually discontinued and replaced with the inclusive methodologies we had developed, proving that discrimination ultimately fails because it excludes the very perspectives and talents necessary for organizational success in competitive markets. Thompson Leadership Solutions stands as a permanent reminder that talent and determination can overcome any obstacle, and that the best response to being excluded from opportunities is creating better opportunities that make the original exclusion seem petty and short-sighted. Sometimes the greatest victory is making your former enemies grateful for the changes you forced them to embrace. The email that arrived on a quiet Thursday morning 3 years after our transformation of TechFlow would prove to be the most satisfying communication I had ever received in my professional career. It came from the Harvard Business School, inviting David and me to co-author a case study about our journey from discrimination victims to industry leaders, specifically focusing on how we had turned systemic bias into a catalyst for revolutionary change in corporate leadership development.
Professor Elizabeth Chen, who headed Harvard's Organizational Behavior Department, explained in her message that our story had become legendary among business academics who studied transformation and resilience. She wanted to document our methodology for future generations of business leaders who might face similar challenges and need inspiration for turning adversity into competitive advantage. Your experience represents a masterclass in strategic response to institutional bias, Professor Chen wrote. The way you transformed personal injustice into systematic reform while building a successful enterprise has applications far beyond your specific industry. We believe your case study will become required reading for anyone studying organizational change and entrepreneurial success. The invitation to collaborate with Harvard represented validation from the highest levels of business academia, but it also provided an opportunity to ensure that our story would influence management education for decades to come. Future business leaders would learn from our experience about the hidden costs of discrimination and the powerful alternatives that emerge when talented people refuse to accept exclusionary practices. David and I spent the following weeks preparing materials for the case study, reviewing emails, legal documents, financial records, and interview transcripts that chronicled our journey from TechFlow's discrimination to Thompson Leadership Solutions' success. The documentation painted a comprehensive picture of how systematic bias had motivated systematic innovation in response. The most compelling evidence came from the financial analysis showing how TechFlow's discriminatory practices had cost them market share, top talent, and competitive positioning, while Thompson Leadership Solutions had captured the value they had abandoned. Their attempt to maintain traditional hierarchies had accelerated their displacement by more innovative and inclusive competitors. The numbers tell an incredible story, David observed as we reviewed profit and loss statements from both companies spanning the 5 years since his first program rejection. TechFlow's revenue growth has averaged 3% annually, while we've maintained double-digit expansion every year. Their discrimination didn't just hurt us personally, it damaged their business fundamentally. The Harvard case study process required extensive interviews with key players from both organizations, including current and former TechFlow employees who had witnessed the discrimination and transformation processes. Many of these conversations revealed details about the corporate culture and decision-making processes that had enabled Robert Mitchell's bias to flourish unchallenged for years. Marcus Thompson, who had become our business partner and co-founder at Thompson Leadership Solutions, provided crucial insights about the industry dynamics that had made our success possible. His perspective as an outsider who had joined our mission helped illustrate how discrimination had created market opportunities that established consulting firms had failed to recognize or address. What Rachel and David accomplished wasn't just remarkable from a personal standpoint, Marcus told the Harvard researchers during his interview. They identified and captured a massive market opportunity that traditional firms had ignored because of their own biases. The demand for inclusive leadership development was always there, but most consultants couldn't see it because they shared the same prejudices as their clients. The research process also involved interviews with TechFlow executives, including Thomas Bradley and even Robert Mitchell, who had agreed to participate as part of his ongoing professional development requirements. These conversations provided fascinating insights into how discrimination had operated from the perpetrator's perspective and how comprehensive intervention had changed organizational culture. Robert's interview was particularly revealing about the psychological dynamics that had motivated his discriminatory behavior. He described feeling threatened by the success of dual-career couples like David and me because it challenged his assumptions about appropriate professional relationships and career advancement pathways. I convinced myself that I was protecting company culture and maintaining professional standards, Robert admitted to the Harvard researchers. In reality, I was protecting my own insecurities and limiting the organization's potential by excluding talented people who didn't fit my narrow definition of appropriate leadership candidates. His candid acknowledgement of bias and its consequences provided powerful testimony about how individual prejudices could become institutional practices when left unchallenged by leadership oversight or organizational accountability measures. The transformation process had forced him to confront the gap between his intentions and the actual impact of his decision-making. The case study development coincided with another significant milestone in our company's evolution, the opening of Thompson Leadership Solutions International Headquarters in London, marking our expansion into European markets. The decision to establish overseas operations reflected both the global demand for our inclusive leadership methodologies and our commitment to spreading transformational practices beyond North American corporate culture.
The London office launch attracted attention from European business media, who were particularly interested in our American success story and its applicability to their own organizational challenges. Several major European corporations had already engaged our services to address diversity and inclusion initiatives that their traditional consulting providers had struggled to implement effectively. The European market is hungry for authentic approaches to inclusive leadership, reported Caroline Walsh, our newly appointed European Managing Director, during the London office opening ceremony. Companies here have invested heavily in diversity initiatives, but many have struggled to achieve meaningful cultural change. Our track record of measurable transformation gives us immediate credibility with clients who are tired of superficial solutions. The international expansion represented more than business growth. It demonstrated that the principles we had developed in response to TechFlow's discrimination had universal application across different corporate cultures and regulatory environments. Bias and exclusion created similar problems everywhere, and our solutions worked regardless of geographic or cultural context. The success in European markets also provided additional validation for our decision to build Thompson Leadership Solutions rather than simply pursuing legal remedies for the discrimination we had experienced. While litigation had been important for accountability and precedent setting, business success had proven to be the more powerful tool for creating systematic change across multiple organizations and industries. During the Harvard case study interviews, Professor Chen asked me to reflect on the decision-making process that had led us to choose entrepreneurship over employment litigation as our primary response to discrimination. The question forced me to articulate the strategic thinking that had guided our approach from the beginning. Legal action addresses past wrongs and can prevent future discrimination through policy changes and financial penalties, I explained to Professor Chen during our recorded interview. But building a successful alternative demonstrates the value of inclusive practices while creating ongoing opportunities for people who face similar challenges. Litigation is backward-looking, entrepreneurship is forward-focused. The distinction had proven crucial to our long-term impact on the leadership development industry. While our settlement with TechFlow had changed their practices and provided precedent for other discrimination cases, Thompson Leadership Solutions had changed market expectations and competitive dynamics across the entire sector. Companies throughout Austin and beyond had been forced to reevaluate their own leadership development approaches as clients increasingly demanded the inclusive methodologies and measurable results that had become our signature. Traditional consulting firms found themselves losing business to competitors who could demonstrate genuine expertise in diverse team leadership and inclusive organizational culture. The ripple effects extended to academic institutions as well, with several business schools revising their leadership development curricula to incorporate the principles and methodologies we had pioneered. Students were learning about inclusive leadership practices as core competencies rather than specialized add-ons, reflecting the fundamental shift in market expectations that our success had accelerated. Your work has influenced how we teach leadership development to the next generation of business executives, Professor Chen told me during one of our case study preparation meetings. Students now expect to learn about bias recognition, inclusive team management, and diverse talent development as fundamental leadership skills, not optional extras for companies with diversity initiatives. The educational impact was particularly satisfying because it addressed the root causes of discriminatory practices by ensuring that future leaders would be better prepared to recognize and prevent bias in their own organizations. Rather than simply responding to discrimination after it occurred, we were helping to prevent it through improved management education. The Harvard case study was published 18 months later and quickly became one of the most requested teaching materials in business school curricula, focusing on organizational transformation, entrepreneurial success, and diversity management. The case was adopted by over 200 universities worldwide and translated into 12 languages for international business education programs. More importantly, the case study's publication generated additional speaking opportunities and consulting engagements that expanded our influence beyond direct client relationships. David and I were invited to address corporate leadership conferences, diversity summits, and academic symposiums, where our story inspired other professionals facing similar challenges while educating organizational leaders about the business costs of discriminatory practices. The speaking circuit also provided platforms for sharing updated research about the correlation between inclusive leadership practices and organizational performance. Our client data consistently demonstrated that companies implementing our methodologies achieve superior results in employee engagement, innovation metrics, and financial performance compared to organizations maintaining traditional hierarchical approaches. The business case for inclusive leadership isn't theoretical anymore. David explained during a keynote presentation to Fortune 500 CEOs attending a leadership summit in Chicago. We have 5 years of data from dozens of client organizations showing that diverse teams led by inclusive managers consistently outperform homogeneous teams with traditional leadership approaches. The question isn't whether you can afford to embrace inclusive practices, but whether you can afford not to. The data validation was crucial for overcoming the skepticism that some executives still harbored about diversity and inclusion initiatives. While many leaders intellectually accepted the moral arguments for inclusive practices, financial performance data provided the concrete evidence necessary to drive widespread adoption of transformational approaches. Our client portfolio had evolved to include some of the most innovative and successful companies in their respective industries, creating a virtuous cycle where our association with high-performing organizations enhanced our credibility while our methodologies contributed to their continued success. The relationship between inclusive leadership and business performance was no longer debatable, it was documented and measurable. The personal satisfaction of this professional success was amplified by the knowledge that our response to discrimination had created opportunities for thousands of other professionals who had faced similar challenges. Every manager trained in inclusive leadership practices, every promotion process redesigned for equity, and every organizational culture transformed from exclusionary to welcoming represented a victory over the discriminatory mindset that had once threatened our own careers. The children who had grown up watching their parents transform injustice into opportunity were now teenagers with sophisticated understanding of social justice, business strategy, and personal resilience. Emma and Michael had internalized lessons about standing up to unfairness and creating positive change that would serve them throughout their own careers and life challenges. I learned that when people try to exclude you from something, it's often because they're afraid of what you might accomplish if given the opportunity. Emma wrote in a college application essay about lessons learned from her family's experience. The best response isn't to prove them wrong, but to create something better than what they denied you access to. Her insight captured the essential wisdom that had guided our approach from the beginning. Discrimination represents fear of competition and change, and the most effective response is demonstrating the value of diversity through superior results, rather than simply arguing for inclusion on moral grounds. The legacy of our journey continued to expand as former Thompson Leadership Solutions employees founded their own consulting firms specializing in inclusive organizational development, spreading our methodologies across additional markets and industry sectors. The principles we had developed in response to TechFlow's discrimination had become the foundation for an entire movement toward more equitable and effective corporate leadership practices. Robert Mitchell, who had been the catalyst for our transformation through his discriminatory behavior, had completed his required development program and achieved genuine insight into the limitations of his previous approach to leadership and organizational culture. His transformation from antagonist to advocate represented one of the most satisfying aspects of our intervention at TechFlow. I spent years trying to preserve what I thought was valuable about traditional corporate culture, Robert reflected during a follow-up interview for the Harvard case study. What I learned through Rachel and David's intervention is that the most valuable aspects of any culture are strengthened by inclusion rather than threatened by it. My resistance to change wasn't protecting anything worth preserving. His acknowledgement of error and commitment to inclusive practices had genuine impact within TechFlow, where his influence as a reformed discriminator carried special weight with other executives who might harbor similar biases. Sometimes the most powerful advocates for change are former opponents who have experienced genuine transformation. TechFlow's evolution from discriminatory organization to inclusion leader had been so comprehensive that they were now being studied by other companies seeking to address their own bias-related challenges. The transformation we had implemented had become a model for organizational change that proved systematic discrimination could be eliminated through committed intervention and accountability measures. The company that had once tried to limit David's career prospects was now sending executives to our leadership development programs and recommending our services to their clients and business partners. The reversal was complete. TechFlow had become one of our most effective marketing channels, demonstrating to potential clients that even the most resistant organizations could be transformed through our methodologies. The greatest victory isn't defeating your enemies. I reflected during a recent interview about our success story. It's transforming them into allies who advocate for the principles they once opposed. TechFlow didn't just stop discriminating against employees like David, they became champions of inclusive practices that benefit everyone in their organization. Thompson Leadership Solutions had achieved something unprecedented in the consulting industry. We had transformed our primary antagonist into our most compelling case study, proving that positive change was possible even in organizations with deeply embedded discriminatory practices. The business lesson was clear. Inclusive leadership wasn't just morally superior, it was competitively advantageous for organizations willing to embrace transformation. As I sit in my office overlooking downtown Austin, reviewing the latest quarterly reports showing continued growth and expansion into new markets, I'm reminded that the most powerful response to discrimination is success that makes the original exclusion seem petty and short-sighted. Robert Mitchell's attempt to limit David's career had inadvertently created the conditions for building something far more valuable than anything TechFlow could have offered. The executive leadership development program that had rejected David 5 times had been completely redesigned according to our inclusive methodologies, and was now considered the gold standard for equitable professional development in the Austin business community. The program that once excluded us had become a showcase for the principles we had developed in response to that exclusion. Our story continues to inspire other professionals facing discrimination and organizational bias, proving that apparent setbacks can become catalysts for extraordinary achievements when approached with strategic thinking and persistent commitment to positive change. Sometimes the best thing that can happen to talented people is being rejected by organizations that don't deserve them. The discrimination that was intended to limit our potential had actually redirected our talents toward building alternatives that made exclusionary practices obsolete and irrelevant. Robert Mitchell and TechFlow had learned that excluding diverse perspectives doesn't protect market position, it creates opportunities for more innovative competitors who understand the value of inclusion. Thompson Leadership Solutions stands as permanent proof that justice isn't always delivered through courtrooms or regulatory agencies. Sometimes the most powerful form of accountability is success that demonstrates the value of everything discriminatory organizations choose to exclude. The best revenge indeed is a life well lived in a business that succeeds by embracing principles your former oppressors were too narrow-minded to understand. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.